They called it God's Desert, a land that tested every soul that dared to settle there. Amid crimson cliffs and blazing sunsets, a solitary widow named Margaret McAllister faced fate's most dangerous gamble. When she found a wounded Apache man dying on her ranch porch one storm-lashed evening, she had no idea her act of compassion would shake the entire frontier. By dawn, 50 fierce Apache warriors appeared at her door, ready for battle or something else entirely. Out here, survival depended on loyalty guns and grit. But Margaret's bold choice would either save her life or doom them all. Margaret McAllister lost her husband James to a stray bullet during a skirmish between rustlers and a local posse. Their modest ranch lay on the outskirts of Gila Bend, Arizona territory, a small settlement overshadowed by desert sprawl and rugged mountains. It was a place known for scorching heat moonlit nights that glittered with 1,000 stars and dust storms that whipped through like vengeful ghosts. Alone in her small adobe house, Margaret had learned to care for the animals, maintain the well, and do the back-breaking labor that once required two. She was no stranger to adversity. She'd grown up in the harsh reality of frontier living, burying her baby brother to disease at 9, and watching her mother pass during a bitter winter. Now, at 28, she had endured enough heartbreak to last a lifetime. Her husband's meager life insurance didn't last long, and her nearest neighbor, a kindly rancher named Bill Kennison, lived 7 miles away, too far for daily company or immediate assistance. Margaret spent her days tending to her goats and a few head of cattle, praying for enough rainfall to salvage a small patch of vegetables. She had learned to shoot her father's old Remington rifle, not out of desire for violence, but pure necessity. In the desert, survival often depended on the steady aim of a gun. The night before the warrior arrived was marked by a rare desert thunderstorm. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant white forks, the thunder shaking the adobe walls of Margaret's modest home. The wind howled across the desert, driving sharp grains of sand under the door and through cracks in the shutters. Margaret was startled awake by a loud crash. Something had toppled the chair on her front porch. Heart pounding, she hurried to grab her rifle, lighting a lantern against the gloom. The moment she opened her front door, the wind nearly tore it from her grasp, blowing rain and sand into her face. She blinked against the stinging grit and saw him, an Apache man, collapsed against the adobe wall, breathing in shallow, ragged gulps. His chest was slick with blood, soaking through his leather tunic. A bullet wound in his side glistened in the flickering lantern light. For a moment, fear paralyzed her. The Apaches had a fierce reputation for defending their land against any encroachment. She had heard the stories, some grounded in truth, others no doubt in prejudice. Margaret knew that harboring an Apache, especially a wounded warrior, could be dangerous. Yet she couldn't just leave him out there to die. Quickly she brought him inside and laid him on her narrow cot, ignoring the uneasy flutter in her stomach. By his features and long black hair, she recognized he might be Chiricahua Apache. She'd heard of their brilliant war leaders, Cochise Geronimo Victorio, names that could instill fear in the hearts of many frontier folk. She tried to remember everything she knew about first aid from the frontier doctor Harold Fremont, who had once visited her and James. She pressed a cloth to the wound, tried to staunch the bleeding. The man opened his eyes briefly, his face contorted in pain, muttering words in a language she didn't understand. With trembling hands, Margaret cleaned his wound as best she could, applying carbolic acid to prevent infection, her heart skipping beats at every groan he made. She sewed up the torn flesh with a needle and thread, sterilized by flame. It was crude and done with more courage than certainty. She cringed at his agony, but he never cried out beyond a low, pained hiss. Once finished, Margaret realized her own hands shook from adrenaline and fear. Outside, thunder rumbled, lightning flared, and the wind rattled the windows. She gave him water, which he sipped slowly. His fevered eyes showed glimpses of thanks, or perhaps desperation. Margaret had no illusions about the danger. If he was part of a local Apache band, they might come looking for him. And if so, how would they react to a white widow harboring their wounded man? She prayed softly, asking the Lord for protection and guidance. Then, wiping sweat and rain from her brow, Margaret sat in the rocking chair across from him, rifle at her side, determined to see him through the night. Whether it would save him or damn her, she had chosen. There was no turning back. Margaret might have dozed off in the early hours of the morning. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the cracks in her shutters, she stirred awake, startled by the stillness, no more wind or rain. The wounded Apache was breathing, albeit weakly. She fetched more water for him. He sipped and tried to speak, but she could only discern a name, Nei. For a moment she thought he was introducing himself, but the tone sounded more like he was calling for someone else. It could have been anything, a prayer, a wife, or a child. She offered him some bread and bacon, but he barely tasted it, grimacing in pain. Then came the unmistakable sound of hoof-beats. Many hoof-beats. Her heart leapt into her throat. Peering through the crack in her window, she saw them emerge from the thinning morning mist, scores of Apache warriors on horseback. She counted at least 50, though there might have been more. Dread iced her veins. They were led by a tall warrior with severe features, braids over each shoulder, and a stoic expression. He signaled for his men to halt near her yard, forming a half-circle around the small adobe house. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She gripped her rifle, her mouth dry as desert sand. She heard a shout in Apache, and another warrior echoed it. This was no random band of travelers. They had come for their wounded. For one horrifying moment, she imagined them burning her home to the ground in retribution for any perceived harm. But they did not charge. Instead, their leader swung gracefully off his horse, ignoring the uneasy stomping of the other animals. Margaret stole a quick glance at the wounded man. His eyes fluttered, and he tried to push himself upright, wincing in pain. She swallowed hard. She had to go out there. If she didn't, they might kick down her door. Summoning courage from a well she didn't know she possessed, she stepped outside, rifle lowered but visible. The sunrise cut across the desert, and in that golden light, she stood face to face with over 50 Apache warriors. Margaret's heart pounded as she carefully placed the butt of the rifle on the ground. Her hands lifted in a gesture meant to convey she wasn't hostile. The tall leader watched her with a silent, assessing gaze. Behind him, the other warriors remained on horseback, rifles and bows at the ready. She felt the weight of those eyes, felt the primal fear that any sudden move could spark violence. She spoke slowly. "He's inside. He was wounded. I tried to help him." She wasn't even sure if the man understood English. He narrowed his eyes. One of the younger warriors, who looked to be in his 20s, dismounted and approached, scanning her face, then shifting his gaze to the door. The leader spoke a few curt words in Apache. The young warrior nodded. Margaret tried not to tremble. "He's alive. Please, just don't hurt me." The young man turned to her, and with an accent murmured, "We see." His English was broken, but understandable. He motioned for her to step aside. She moved away from the door as the tall leader and 2 other warriors followed the younger man inside. Margaret held her breath. The tension twisted in her belly, and she felt a powerful urge to run. But where 50 Apaches surrounded her ranch, there was nowhere to go. She heard voices inside, low and urgent, as they presumably found their wounded comrade. She pictured them raising their weapons, accusing her of harming him. Maybe they'd see her stitches, call her a butcher. Memories of frontier gossip filled her mind. Stories of Apaches raiding and leaving no survivors. Yet here she stood unscathed on this edge of a moment that could bring blood or a fragile peace. The leader stepped out first. He fixed Margaret with an inscrutable stare. Then, to her surprise, he signaled the other warriors to stand down. A murmur went through the group, and they relaxed on their saddles. The young interpreter who had followed him outside spoke quietly. "You saved him." Margaret nodded stiffly. "I couldn't just let him die." The leader's posture softened, if only a little. He spoke a few words, and the young man translated. "He thanks you. Says that was courageous." Margaret almost wept with relief. Courageous or foolish? She felt her legs wobble beneath her. The leader gestured for 2 of his men to tend to their comrade. They carried him out gently, placing him on a litter of woven blankets. Margaret watched as they worked with a well-practiced efficiency, carefully loading the wounded warrior onto one of the horses. Before they left, the leader turned back, eyes meeting Margaret's. He spoke again, and the young man translated. "He is Ralnote, war leader of this band. He says you will not be harmed. He says your house is safe, because you had mercy on one of ours." Margaret nodded in mute awe. She felt the sting of tears, not fully understanding what had just passed, but sensing the gravity of it. Ralnote raised his hand in a sort of farewell gesture, then mounted his horse. In a swirl of dust and hoofbeats, the Apaches departed 50 strong, heading east through the desert, following the purple silhouettes of the distant mountains. Long after they vanished, Margaret remained standing, heart racing, tears in her eyes. She had done what she believed was right, helping a wounded man in need. And though her actions might have put her in terrible danger, it had also brought a moment of human compassion and surprising gratitude. Little did she realize this was only the beginning of a journey that would test her mettle in ways she never imagined. Later that same day, Margaret's closest neighbor, Bill Kennison, arrived in a rattling wagon. He was a balding man in his 40s, beard streaked with gray from sun and stress. She could see alarm on his face the moment he set foot in the yard. "You all right?" he called, glancing around as though expecting Apache raiders to ambush him at any second. "Heard talk in town that a band of warriors was seen riding this way." She forced a small smile, though she was still shaken. "I'm okay, Bill." He stepped closer, scanning the ground as if the hoof prints might verify her story. What happened? She told him everything. Finding the wounded Apache, the storm, the arrival of the 50 warriors at dawn, and how they left peacefully once they realized she had helped their comrade. Bill listened quietly, arms folded. His weathered face hardened in worry. "That's risky business, Margaret," he sighed. "You know how folks in Gila Bend feel about Apaches these days. There was trouble with rustlers and a band of renegades near old Fort Bowie last month. Colonel Ranald S. Mackenzie's been patrolling the territory, trying to bring order." She lowered her gaze. "I couldn't let him die, Bill. I did what I had to." He gripped her shoulder gently. "I ain't blaming you. But be cautious. If the town hears you're harboring Apaches, you could be labeled a sympathizer or worse." She understood his concern. Tensions across the Arizona territory still simmered with each new rumor of raids or conflicts. Although large-scale warfare had died down compared to the days of Cochise, fear persisted. And fear had a way of warping truth, making folks see enemies where there might be friends. Before leaving, Bill gave her a spare bag of flour and some coffee beans. Little comforts meant to help her hold on until her next supply run. He also promised to keep an ear to the ground in Gila Bend to gauge the mood in town. Margaret thanked him, watching his wagon rattle down the trail until the swirling dust swallowed it. That night, Margaret sat by the faint glow of her oil lamp, writing in a small diary she'd kept since she was a girl. She scribbled about the encounter, the quiet strength in the Apache leader's eyes, and how she felt at once terrified and oddly reassured. She ended her entry with a simple line, "I pray tomorrow will be peaceful, but something in me says, this is not over." Within a week, word spread like wildfire across Gila Bend that Margaret McAllister had encountered a whole band of Apaches. Some said she was nearly killed. Others claimed she'd welcomed them in for tea. The real story existed somewhere between rumor and speculation. Truth seldom mattered once fear took hold. Margaret traveled into town for supplies the following Thursday. People paused in the street to stare. A cluster of men in front of the mercantile store whispered loudly enough for her to catch phrases like "Injun lover" and "crazy widow." She kept her head high, but felt the burn of their disapproval. Inside the store, old Mrs. Turner, who minded the counter, seemed nervous. She gave Margaret curt greetings, avoiding eye contact. The store was quiet except for a single clerk who busied himself stacking cans of peaches. After paying for her Staples flour sugar, a new spool of thread, Margaret paused to gather her courage. "Miss Turner, is everything all right?" Folks look on edge. Mrs. Turner shifted her gaze around the store as if fearing eavesdroppers. In a low voice, she said, "Margaret, some men want the army to look into what happened at your ranch. They say the Apaches might be planning to raid. They also say maybe you invited them." Margaret felt a surge of anger. "That's nonsense. I found a dying man I know." Mrs. Turner interrupted gently. "But we live in fearful times. Colonel Mackenzie's men have been riding through these parts. The Mayor Bill Stone is pressuring them to keep the territory safe, especially after some Saul raids last month near the border." Margaret's knuckles turned white around the handle of her basket. She thanked Mrs. Turner and walked outside, chest tight with anxiety. If the army came poking around her ranch, how would they react to hearing she had patched up an Apache warrior? Some of these officers assumed the worst about any alliance between settlers and native people. She dreaded the possibility of being labeled a traitor or forced to leave her home. After loading her supplies into a borrowed wagon, she steered the tired mare down the dusty road back to her ranch. She felt every stare, sensed every whispered rumor. The scorching sun did little to melt the chill in her stomach. 2 days later, just before sundown, Margaret noticed a lone rider approaching. She peered from her porch rifle close at hand in case it was trouble. As the figure drew near, she recognized him. Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, a name she had heard from Bill Kennison. Gatewood was known across the territory for having brokered talks with certain Apache leaders, including Geronimo, in the not-so-distant past. He was tall, with sandy hair and a calm bearing. He reined in his horse and lifted a hand in greeting. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, voice steady. "May I dismount?" She nodded, cautious. "Yes, sir." Gatewood swung off his horse and removed his hat, revealing sweat-matted hair. He glanced around the property, noticing the well, the goats, the swirl of dust in the warm evening air. I'm here on behalf of Colonel Mackenzie. We've heard some interesting stories. I'd like to speak with you about your recent encounter with the Apaches. Margaret folded her arms over her apron. I suppose you want to know if I'm plotting with them? A faint smile touched the corner of Gatewood's mouth. That depends on what you tell me. He asked politely if he could sit, and she led him to 2 battered chairs on the porch. She offered him cool water from the well. Gatewood thanked her, and took a long drink, wiping sweat from his brow. Margaret recounted the entire event, the wounded Apache stumbling upon her ranch, the storm, how she tended to him and the arrival of the band the next morning. She explained that the leader took his wounded comrade and left peacefully. Gatewood listened intently, not interrupting, occasionally nodding. When she finished, he set his cup down. That aligns with reports we've had of an Apache band moving through these parts. They haven't attacked any settlements as far as we know. Colonel Mackenzie wants to ensure they don't plan to. But your story suggests they were only retrieving their wounded, showing you respect in return. Margaret exhaled, relieved that he wasn't leaping to accuse her. Yes. I don't regret what I did. Gatewood studied her. You acted out of compassion. That's admirable. The question is, do you think they might return? She gazed into the distance, the desert sky aflame with sunset hues. I can't say. If they do, I hope it's with the same peaceful intent. Gatewood rose to leave. If they return, or if you see signs of trouble, please notify me or the colonel. We have a small patrol stationed near Gila Bend for the next few weeks. No one wants a war. Margaret nodded. I'll keep that in mind, Lieutenant. He tipped his hat. Thank you for your time. Stay safe. With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Margaret alone with the hush of the twilight desert. She felt a sense of cautious optimism. Gatewood seemed reasonable, unlike some hot-headed vigilantes or suspicious townsfolk. Perhaps everything would settle. Perhaps the Apaches would simply pass through, never to cross her path again. Less than a week passed before Margaret had visitors again, though not from the army or the townspeople. Late one moonlit night, she woke to hear a soft rapping on her door. Heart thumping, she grabbed her rifle and inched to the window. Outside stood a solitary figure, a woman wearing a fringed dress and moccasins. 2 men remained on horseback, their faces partially obscured by the darkness. Their presence was silent, almost ghostly, in the luminous desert night. Margaret cracked the door. The woman spoke softly in broken English. He is sick. The man you helped. Very bad fever. A chill ran through Margaret. He survived. The woman nodded. Yes, but infection fever. We do what we can. Need more medicine. Please. Margaret's mind spun. She knew enough about frontier medicine to realize that if the wound had become infected, the man's life hung in the balance. He might need the same carbolic acid or other supplies she used before. She didn't have a doctor's skill, but she might have the medicine. It was a moral question. Once again, step out of the conflict or extend the hand of healing. She stepped back to gather what she had. Bandages, the last of her carbolic acid. Some dried herbs recommended by Dr. Fremont for fever. Tying them into a small satchel, she took a deep breath and walked outside, boots crunching in the dust. The 2 men on horseback appeared tense, but they did not threaten her. The woman accepted the satchel with a grateful bow of her head. In the moonlight, Margaret could see tears glimmer in the woman's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Before they left, the woman reached for Margaret's hand. She placed a small turquoise amulet in her palm, The smooth stone glowed faintly in the silver light. Margaret felt the warmth of the woman's gratitude and the intangible bond that their shared compassion created. Without another word, they departed, vanishing into the desert shadows, as silently as they had come. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She clutched the turquoise amulet, wondering about the man she'd saved. Was she stepping deeper into a conflict that was not hers? Would the townspeople condemn her more if they knew? She closed her eyes, recalling Ralnote's inscrutable gaze. The Apaches clearly trusted her, or at least valued her enough to ask for help again. For her compassion wasn't a choice. It was an imperative, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, the desert air felt heavier, weighted by tension and the impending heat of summer. Margaret noticed more riders on the horizon, some the watchful cavalry patrols under Colonel Mackenzie's orders, others shady figures who might have been scouting for rustlers or planning some mischief. In town, the rumors continued. She heard second-hand that a vigilante group was forming ranchers and townsfolk who wanted to take matters into their own hands, convinced Apaches were on the brink of a raid. They met secretly at the saloon after dark, fueled by whiskey and prejudice. A name kept floating to the top of these rumors. Jeb Holcomb, a known loudmouth and troublemaker with a personal grudge against the local Apaches. Word was that Apaches had stolen some of his cattle years ago, or so he claimed. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Gatewood and a small detachment of soldiers passed through Guyla Bend regularly, trying to keep the peace, but tensions rose daily. Margaret found herself torn between wanting to inform Gatewood of her nighttime visitors and fearing that it might only spark more conflict. If the army knew the Apaches were close by, might they initiate a chase or confrontation? She woke every morning scanning the horizon for dust trails, half expecting Ralnote to reappear, or for Jeb Holcomb's gang to show up demanding answers. She continued to do her chores, feed her goats, gather eggs from her few hens, and pump water from the well. Life on the ranch demanded constant work, even when her heart was troubled. One stifling afternoon, Margaret walked to the edge of her property with an empty bucket to fetch water from the slow-running creek. She was about to kneel when she heard a twig snap behind her. She spun around to see a stranger standing there. A man in grubby clothes armed with a revolver. His face twisted in a sneer. Behind him stood two other men, similarly armed. "Howdy, widow," he said, voice dripping with menace. "Heard you've been chummy with some Apaches." Her mouth went dry. She recognized one of them by description, the tall, wiry figure and scarred cheek. This was Jeb Holcomb. I don't know you," she lied, refusing to betray fear. He cocked his head. "Name's Jeb Holcomb, and I'm fixin' to stop you from making trouble for this town. You see, folks say you're giving the Apaches medicine supplies, that you're inviting them right into our territory." Anger flared through Margaret's fear. "I'm not bringing them here. I found a wounded man and helped him. That's all," his cronies snickered. Jeb spat on the ground. "A mighty dangerous friend you got. Word is they're banding together with other tribes about to storm us. There's got to be a reason they're so close to your place." She realized with dread that once rumors took hold, logic was useless. Holcomb's men fanned out, cornering her against the creek bed. She glanced at her rifle, lying on the ground, 4 steps away. Too far. 3 guns against her was an impossible fight. "What do you want?" she demanded, keeping her voice steady. "Information," Jeb growled. "Where are they hiding? When are they coming? Are you spying for 'em, or are they blackmailing you?" "Neither," she said, trying to keep her tone calm. "They came, and for their wounded man, they left. I haven't seen them since." The man on Jeb's right, short and broad-shouldered, took a menacing step closer. "Don't lie, woman. We heard from a ranch hand that saw Apaches outside your house just last night." Her heart seized. So someone saw. She swallowed. "They asked for medicine. The man is dying fever from infection." Jeb's expression darkened. "So you admit it. You helped them again?" Margaret couldn't contain her fury. Is it a crime to save a life? In a flash, Jeb's arm shot out, backhanding her across the cheek. She stumbled, tasting coppery blood on her lip. "It's a crime if it helps those savages kill our families." They advanced, and the fear in Margaret's gut crystallized. She realized this wasn't just an interrogation. They might hurt her, or worse. She took a step back, edging closer to her rifle. Her mind spun, searching for an escape. Then came a loud voice from behind the men. "Hold it right there." Everyone froze, turning to see Bill Kennison and 2 other ranchers from Gila Bend, rifles drawn. Bill's face was grim as a desert storm. He had come by for a visit, only to stumble upon Jeb's assault. "I suggest you leave Margaret be," Bill warned. Jeb glared, calculating. With Bill and 2 others, it was an even fight. Jeb cursed under his breath, spat on the ground again, and holstered his revolver. "We're not done," he growled at Margaret, then motioned for his men to walk away. Margaret leaned against a tree, trying to steady her breath. Bill and the other ranchers rushed to her side. She blinked back, tears. "Thank you. They might have killed me." Bill's jaw clenched. "Might have. But not while I'm breathing. Word's gotten real twisted in town. Keep your door locked, Margaret. I'll ask around, see if we can get her Gatewood to keep an eye out." She nodded, grateful but shaken to her core. As Bill rode off, she touched her bruised cheek, anger and sorrow mingling. Compassion was a risky virtue out here. She wondered how long it would be before another threat arrived, maybe even from the army, if Jeb stirred up enough trouble. That night, Margaret stared at the turquoise amulet the Apache woman had given her. Its polished surface shone dully in the lantern light, reminding her of the bond she'd inadvertently forged. Were they out there now, nursing their comrade back to health? Was he improving or growing worse? She paced the small adobe house, wrestling with indecision. She wanted to warn them that men like Jeb Holcomb were prowling for blood. But how could she find them? She had no idea where their camp was. There was a chance they'd appear again, seeking more medicine. Another thought gnawed at her. What if Jeb Holcomb and his men found their camp first? At length, exhaustion overwhelmed her. She dozed fitfully, waking to every coyote howl and the faint rustle of wind against the shutters. Dawn broke in a pale haze. Margaret forced herself to do her morning chores, each step feeling heavier. She contemplated traveling into the desert alone, searching for the Apache camp, but that was reckless at best, suicidal at worst. By midday, she resolved to talk to Lieutenant Gatewood. Perhaps he could intervene peacefully. She saddled her mare Dolly and rode off toward the small army outpost near Gila Bend, keeping a vigilant eye out for trouble. A swirl of dust on the horizon signaled riders. She hoped they weren't vigilantes. When she arrived at the outpost, a collection of tents and one wooden barracks Gatewood was there, conferring with a few soldiers. He looked surprised to see Margaret. After stepping aside, he greeted her politely. "I need your help," she said. Her voice trembled with urgency. She recounted Jeb Holcomb's threats, the bruise on her face, the tension in town. "Holcomb believes I'm collaborating with the Apaches, that they're planning an attack. It's not true, but I fear bloodshed if someone doesn't intervene." Gatewood frowned, scanning her bruised cheek. "I'm sorry you had to endure that, Mrs. McAllister. I've heard rumors of a vigilante group forming. The Colonel's orders are to keep the peace, but we're spread thin." She steadied herself. "You have to stop Jeb. He's convinced the Apaches are about to raid, and if he finds them, it'll be a massacre on one side or the other. I can't stand by and watch more violence." Gatewood nodded thoughtfully. "I'll talk to Colonel Mackenzie. Perhaps we can increase patrols or try to locate the Apache band before the vigilantes do. But you need to be careful. Holcomb could come after you again." Margaret clenched her fists. "I'll do what I must. Just don't let innocents die because of a rumor." He promised to do what he could. Margaret thanked him, mounting Dolly to return home. Along the way, her eyes stung with tears. She wanted so desperately to protect both her neighbors and the Apaches who had shown her unexpected mercy. But was there a place for mercy on this lawless frontier days, passed in a tense stalemate? Margaret scanned the horizon each morning, half hoping to see Ral Noté or one of his people come for more supplies, so she could warn them of Holcomb's group. But no one came. She busied herself patching the roof, baking bread, mending clothes, everyday tasks that felt trivial amid the looming threat. Late one afternoon, she rode out to check on a missing goat and found it near a rocky outcropping. As she led the goat back, she spotted a faint column of smoke curling from the base of a distant mesa. Her heart thudded. That might be the Apache camp, or it could be a prospector's fire. After a moment's hesitation, she tethered Dolly in a small gully and proceeded on foot, creeping across the desert to investigate. The sun blazed overhead, scorching her neck. She carefully avoided stepping on dry twigs or loose rocks that might make noise. Drawing closer, she glimpsed a small encampment of hide tents nestled between sandstone boulders. She saw perhaps a dozen Apaches, mostly women and children. It wasn't the entire band, maybe just a portion. Margaret's heart pounded with both apprehension and determination. She raised her hands and emerged from behind a boulder, calling out softly. A startled cry went up from a young girl tending a cooking pot. Instantly, a man appeared with a bow and arrow drawn taut. Margaret froze, arms up, showing she carried no weapon. She recognized the woman who had come to her door, standing by a small fire. She said something in Apache, and the man relaxed his bow slightly. Margaret took a slow, cautious step forward. "Please," she said, a voice shaking. "I only came to warn you. There are men hunting you vigilantes led by a man named Jeb Holcomb. They want blood." The woman nodded, eyes wide with alarm. She spoke rapidly in their language to another older man, perhaps a tribal elder. He eyed Margaret with distrust, but eventually gestured for her to sit on a nearby rock. The woman approached haltingly, and in halting English asked, "Why?" "Warn us," Margaret's chest tightened. "Because you helped me. Or, your leader showed me mercy when I helped your wounded man. I don't want you to be ambushed." A faint stirring swept the small encampment. Margaret noticed a makeshift lean-to at the far edge. Lying there was the wounded warrior she'd stitched up. He looked pale, sweating eyes half closed. She realized he was still desperately ill. "I brought carbolic acid," she whispered, removing a small flask from her satchel. If you trust me, I can try to help again." After a tense moment, the woman and the elder conferred. A decision was made. They led Margaret to the wounded man, who moaned softly. She cleaned his wound, which oozed infection. The smell was foul. She pressed a fresh poultice of desert herbs and carbolic acid, ignoring the wave of nausea at the sight of the putrid drainage. In the midst of her work, she felt eyes upon her young girls, older women, even a few warriors who'd emerged from behind boulders. Some whispered, some looked on with guarded curiosity. Margaret realized this was bigger than just one life. She was bridging a vast cultural divide with her hands and simple compassion. Yet she couldn't shake the lingering dread that Jeb Holcomb could show up any minute. When Margaret finished, she gestured for the woman to give the man water. She made signs to let them know he should rest and keep the wound clean. The woman who introduced herself as Iskala explained in her limited English that Ralnote and many warriors were out hunting or scouting. They were planning to leave the territory soon if the man who was named Taza could travel. But Taza was too weak to move without risking death. Margaret mulled over the situation. Time was running out. If Jeb Holcomb's vigilantes found this camp first, it would be a massacre, women, children, the sick. She thought of going back to Gila Bend to warn Gatewood, but the army might not arrive in time. And if the Apaches stayed put, they were sitting ducks. She lowered her head, thinking hard. You must leave this place, or find a safer hideout somewhere the vigilantes won't suspect. She paused, trying to recall the geography. There are caves in the foothills, south of the Santan Mountains. It might be safer there. Iskala and the elder listened intently, though they seemed hesitant. Can Taza ride? Iskala asked, gesturing to the wounded man. Margaret stared at Taza's pallid face. He might die on the journey. But if you stay, you'll all be in danger. A hush fell. The elder whispered in Apache, and the gathered people murmured in agreement or protest. At last the elder nodded, turning to Margaret. Through Iskala he asked, You. Help guide. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. Guide them. If the vigilantes caught her leading a group of Apaches to safety, they'd brand her a traitor. Gatewood might not be able to protect her from that charge. And yet how could she refuse knowing that leaving these people to be slaughtered was unthinkable? She swallowed her throat dry. I'll guide you. But we must be careful. Iskala squeezed her hand gently, a silent message of thanks. The elder set plans in motion. 2 younger warriors prepared a travois, a simple stretcher that could be dragged by a horse for Taza. Others quickly broke down their small tents, gathering supplies and water skins. Margaret prayed that Ralnote and the scouting warriors would return soon, or meet them on the way. Every second felt like a drumbeat of impending doom. They waited until dusk to move, hoping to slip away under cover of darkness. Margaret fetched Dolly her mare from where she had tethered her. The Apaches had a few horses of their own, mostly sturdy desert ponies. Taza was strapped to the travois, moaning softly in fever dreams. In a ragged procession, they left the camp, weaving through rocky defiles that Margaret had scouted over the years. She led them south, mindful of the ridges where watchers could lurk. A single slip, one loud noise, might expose them to roving vigilantes or even curious cavalry patrols. The moon rose full and bright, turning the desert to silver. Shadows stretched across the sand, and coyotes yipped in the distance. Margaret's nerves tingled, expecting gunshots at any moment. Iskala walked beside her carrying a small child. The elder rode at the front, scanning the horizon. Hours passed like a fragile dream. The small band halted to rest at a secluded waterhole, letting the horses drink quietly. Margaret knelt by Tarza's travois, checking his fever. His skin burned. She dripped a few drops of water on his cracked lips. He opened his eyes briefly, whispering something in Apache. She recognized a single word, "Thank you." Her heart twisted. Pushing on through the night, they followed a dry riverbed, heading east, then turned south. Faint starlight guided them, but the path was precarious. Twice they had to backtrack to avoid dead ends and steep gullies. By dawn, Margaret's muscles ached, and her eyes drooped from exhaustion, but she pressed on. This was life or death for the Apaches who had entrusted their fates to her. Around sunrise, they reached the foothills near the Santan Mountains. Margaret spotted a cluster of kefs in the cliff walls as she'd remembered. It was a natural fortress with a narrow entrance that would be easy to defend or hide. Relief washed over her. If they made it inside, they'd have a chance to rest to nurse Tarza back to health, and with luck, avoid Jeb's men. No sooner had the group neared the cave entrance than a chilling sight appeared on the horizon, a plume of dust shaped by galloping horses. Fear twisted Margaret's gut. Vigilantes! They must have followed the tracks or guessed where the Apaches were heading. A frantic scramble ensued. The elder urged the group to hurry into the caves, but the traveling was slow with Tarza's travois. The young warriors scrambled for vantage points along the rocks. Margaret grabbed her rifle, her palms slick with sweat. She might have to fight for these people who were strangers just days ago, but who now felt like kin. The riders drew closer. Through the swirling dust, she glimpsed Jeb Holcomb at the lead, accompanied by 6 or 7 men. Not as large a group as she feared, but enough to be deadly. They reined in at a distance, forming a line, rifles at the ready. Jeb hollered across the gap. "Well, well. Ain't this a sight, the widow out here leading Apaches straight to our doorstep?" Margaret's voice shook with anger. "They're not hurting anyone, Jeb. Let them go." He spat his face red. "Like hell I will. They've been stealing, killing who knows what else. And you're helping 'em hide. That makes you just as guilty." Margaret's fists clenched around her rifle. "That's a lie. They're just trying to survive." Bullets whined off the rocks. Jeb's men opened fire. The Apaches scrambled behind boulders for cover. A few arrows were loosed in response, thudding into the ground near the vigilantes' horses. Chaos erupted, dust clouds swirling. Margaret ducked behind a rock, returning fire, heart pounding. Her shot whizzed wide, striking the sand. She was no sharpshooter, but she had to try. From the corner of her eye, she saw an Apache warrior topple to the ground, a bullet tearing into his shoulder. Another vigilante cursed, clutching his leg as he slumped in the saddle. The gun battle escalated, echoing off the stone walls. Iskala and the women huddled near Tarza's travois, shielding the children. Margaret risked a glance over the rock. Jeb was reloading his rifle with a sneer, yelling, "Kill 'em all!" Suddenly, a thunder of hoofbeats approached from behind. Margaret whirled to see cavalry troopers, streaming into view Lieutenant Gatewood at the head. They must have tracked the vigilantes or responded to Bill Kennison's pleas for help. The army formed a line, rifles raised. "Cease fire!" Gatewood roared. "In the name of the United States. Army, stand down." Jeb's men hesitated, but Jeb snarled and tried to shoot again. A trooper's bullet knocked the rifle from his hands, sending him reeling. The cavalry quickly surrounded the vigilantes, forcing them to drop their weapons. The entire skirmish lasted only moments, but in Margaret's mind, it felt like an eternity. Gatewood dismounted and hurried over to Margaret. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, trembling, adrenaline surging. "No. Some of them are wounded. Apaches and vigilantes alike." Without a second's pause, Gatewood turned to his men. "Get a field medic up here. Triage the injured on both sides." Margaret slumped against a boulder, relief flooding her. Jeb was on his knees cursing at the soldiers, but they ignored him, binding his hands. The Apaches remained cautious weapons, still at the ready, uncertain if the army's arrival meant salvation or a new threat. Gatewood raised his hands, speaking firmly but calmly. "We have no quarrel with you," he said to the Apaches. "Lower your weapons. We will ensure no harm comes to you if you do the same." It was a tense standoff for a few heartbeats. Then slowly, the Apache elder emerged, leaning on a carved staff. He said something in his native tongue to the warriors, and they cautiously lowered their bows and rifles. Gatewood sighed, relief etched in his features. As the dust settled, the cavalry medic bandaged the wounded Apache warrior's shoulder. Another soldier tended to a vigilante's bullet-scraped arm. Margaret rushed to Tarza's travois, gently stroking his damp hair. He still burned with fever, but now they had a chance to save him. Gatewood ordered a soldier to bring a water canteen and more bandages. When Jeb Holcomb realized he and his men were under arrest, he railed against Gatewood. "They're the enemy. You're betraying your own kind." Gatewood's stoic gaze flickered with contempt. "These Apaches haven't attacked anyone. You shot first." Jeb spat on the ground, spewing insults, but Gatewood ignored him. With the vigilantes disarmed and furious, the soldiers disarmed the Apache warriors as well, though more gently placing rifles and bows aside. The situation was delicate. Any misstep could reignite violence. Margaret approached Gatewood as he conversed with the elder through a translator. Private Thomas, a soldier who spoke some Apache. The elder explained they were simply traveling to rejoin their main band. But Tarza's injury forced them to seek refuge. They had no intention of raiding or harming settlers. Finally, Gatewood turned to Margaret, exhaustion in his eyes. "Thank you for trying to protect them. You risked everything." She swallowed. "I only did what anyone with a heart would do." He sighed. "Not everyone sees it that way, unfortunately." They arranged for the Apaches to stay temporarily in the caves while Tarza recovered under Gatewood's guarantee of safety. Holcomb's men were to be detained and handed over to local authorities for unlawful vigilantism. Whether they'd face actual punishment in a frontier court was uncertain, but Gatewood would do his best to ensure justice was served. Over the following days, an uneasy truce hovered in the foothills. The cavalry stayed camped nearby, ensuring neither vigilantes nor unscrupulous ranchers tried to attack. Margaret tended to Tarza with the army medic, slowly fighting off his infection. In time, Tarza's fever broke. He managed to sit upright and speak halting words of English. "Thank you," he said, eyes gleaming with gratitude. "You saved me." Margaret smiled gently. "I'm happy to see you well, Tarza." Iskala and the others fussed around him, preparing broth and herbs, while Gatewood oversaw logistical matters. Eventually, Ralnote and the rest of the warriors returned alarmed to find their people in the caves under army watch. But after a tense meeting, Gatewood convinced them the army did not seek their capture, only to prevent violence. In a surprising turn of events, Colonel Mackenzie himself arrived to confirm the situation. He was a gruff man, but he trusted Gatewood's assessment. Mackenzie agreed to let the Apache band move on once Tarza could travel, provided they pledged not to raid or disrupt settlements. Ralnote, though proud, recognized the precarious situation and gave his word. Margaret witnessed these negotiations from the edges, marveling at the sight of men who might have killed each other, sitting in cautious dialogue. The frontier's harshness often overshadowed any chance at understanding, but here, amid dust and bloodshed, something akin to trust began to form. At last, the day came when the Apaches were ready to depart. Taza, though weakened, insisted on riding a horse rather than lying on the travois. The morning sun cast long shadows as the band prepared to head south, following a route that would eventually lead them closer to the New Mexico border, away from Gila Bend. Margaret stood by Dolly, her mare feeling a bittersweet pang. Over these weeks, she'd shared tears, pain, and hope with these people who had once been strangers. Ralnote approached her, his solemn expression giving way to a faint smile as he placed his hand over his heart. He spoke in Apache, and Escala translated quietly. "He says you have a strong heart. He will not forget your kindness." Margaret blinked away tears and nodded. "I will never forget yours either." Taza, perched on his horse, dipped his head in thanks. He opened his hand to show the small turquoise amulet that Escala had given Margaret. She realized she was wearing it on a leather string around her neck. She lifted it out from under her collar, holding it up, and Taza smiled a silent understanding that they would remain connected by gratitude, even across the vast desert. Gatewood and the soldiers flanked the band, ensuring safe passage away from the area. Margaret watched until the distant shapes blended into the shimmering horizon. A wave of sadness and relief washed over her. The crisis had passed. But she knew the frontier was vast, and old animosities ran deep. The fate of Taza Ralnote and the others remained uncertain in a land that seemed to devour hope as readily as it did water. In the weeks that followed, Gila Bend buzzed with stories of how the Apache band was spared a violent fate, thanks in part to the widow who had shown them mercy. Jeb Holcomb and his men were briefly jailed, though the local justice system was lenient. Still, their authority was broken. No longer could they claim moral high ground for the army's intervention, proved their vigilantism unwelcome. Margaret, for her part, faced some lingering distrust from a handful of townsfolk. But others, most notably, Bill Kennison, Mrs. Turner from the Mercantile, and even Mayor Bill Stone came to respect her bravery. In quieter moments, many admitted that sparing innocent lives was indeed the right thing, even if it challenged their preconceived prejudices. Lieutenant Gatewood dropped by her ranch one day, months later, while she was mending a fence post. He brought news that Colonel Mackenzie planned to leave a smaller patrol in the region, but hostilities had calmed. Gatewood himself might be reassigned soon, likely out of the Arizona Territory. "You've done a good thing here, Mrs. McAllister," he said, tipping his hat. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She nodded, smiling. "Thank you, Lieutenant." In her heart, Margaret wondered if Taza had fully recovered, if Ralnote had led his people to a safer land, free from pursuit. Sometimes at night, she'd gaze at the turquoise amulet and imagine them riding under starlit skies. Perhaps they found a place to call home. Perhaps they still lived on the edge, as Apaches had done for generations. Either way, Margaret lived on at her ranch, continuing to feed her animals, bake her bread, patch her roof, and write in her diary. The desert still tested her will, and sorrow lingered from the loss of her husband. But in her memories, she carried a testament to compassion's power to break through even the thickest walls of fear. She was still a widow, but no longer alone. She had forged a bond with people once deemed enemies, and in doing so she discovered that kindness could bloom in the harshest soil. If that wasn't a kind of freedom, freedom from hate, freedom from blind vengeance, then Margaret McAllister didn't know what was. And so ends the story of the brave widow who sheltered a dying Apache and found 50 warriors at her door by dawn. Though the Arizona sun can be unforgiving and conflict can strike without warning, Margaret McAllister's courage illuminated a path of compassion in the darkness. Her unflinching act of mercy saved lives on both sides and proved that a single choice can reshape fate on the wild frontier. If this story has touched your heart, shown you a new perspective, or stirred your passion for history's hidden tales, we invite you to join our journey. Like this video, to help others discover Margaret's legacy. Share it with friends who love a gripping Wild West drama, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next compelling true-life saga we uncover. Together, let's keep these stories alive, reminding us that hope can thrive even in the harshest deserts.